Icelanders built their identity on Viking purity. DNA proved a third of their ancestry came from Irish slaves. Iceland is one of the most genetically studied nations on Earth. Its geographic isolation in the North Atlantic, detailed genealogical records stretching back over 1,000 years, and a relatively small population of roughly 370,000 people have made it an unparalleled natural laboratory for human genetics research. Since the earliest days of population genomics, the national mythology was simple. Norse Vikings settled Iceland starting in 874 CE. They came from Norway. The founding story was written in the sagas. Norse chieftains sailing west. Pure Scandinavian blood. The Landmabke, compiled in the 12th century, lists over 400 original settlers and their families who colonized Iceland between 874 and 930 CE. Almost all are described as Norse chieftains from western Norway, with a handful noted as coming from Norse settlements in the British Isles. The sagas paint a picture of an exclusively Scandinavian founding population, establishing a new commonwealth in the North Atlantic. But the sagas were written by the elite. They recorded the stories of chieftains and landowners. They did not record who came as cargo. The slaves had no sagas. DNA gave them one. Viking raids on Ireland and Scotland between the 8th and 10th centuries were not just plundering expeditions for gold and silver. They were slave raids. The Norse captured thousands of men and women from Irish and Scottish communities and transported them across the North Atlantic as forced labor and concubines for the new Icelandic settlements. The Viking slave trade was one of the largest forced population movements in early medieval Europe. Historical records from Ireland document the raids in detail. Monasteries were primary targets. Entire communities were taken. Irish monastic chronicles recorded raid after raid across the 8th, 9th, and 10th centuries. The annals describe ships departing Irish harbors, loaded not just with silver chalices and jeweled reliquaries, but with chained men, women, and children destined for Norse settlements, from Dublin to Reykjavik. These were the people the sagas forgot. Irish and Scottish captives who became Iceland's invisible foundation. The Norse established slave markets across their colonial network. Dublin was one of the largest, where captured Irish men and women were bought and sold alongside silver, furs, and amber. The slave trade was not incidental to the Viking economy. It was central to it, generating a significant portion of the wealth that funded Norse expansion across the North Atlantic. Archaeological excavations in Dublin have uncovered evidence of one of the largest slave markets in early medieval Northern Europe. Dublin was founded by Vikings as a slave trading port. The city's origins are inseparable from the Irish slave trade. Estimates of the total number of Irish people enslaved during the Viking Age range from tens of thousands to over 100,000 across 2 centuries of raiding. The genetic evidence in Iceland represents just one destination for this vast forced diaspora of Celtic peoples across the North Atlantic world. For 2 centuries, Irish coastal communities feared the Norse ships. The genetic legacy is now measurable thousands of kilometers away. In 2000, the first major genetic study proved the slaves had left their mark permanently in Icelandic DNA. Agnar Helgason and colleagues at Decode Genetics published a landmark study analyzing mitochondrial DNA and Y-chromosome data from modern Icelanders. The results shattered the pure Viking myth. Roughly 37% of Icelandic maternal lineages traced not to Scandinavia, but to the British Isles, specifically Ireland and Scotland. On the paternal side, approximately 20% of Y-chromosome lineages also came from the British Isles, rather than Norway. More than a third of Icelandic maternal ancestors were not Viking women. They were Irish captives. The sex-biased pattern is the genetic signature of slavery. More Irish and Scottish women entered the Icelandic gene pool than men because female captives were taken as concubines and household slaves, while male captives had fewer opportunities to reproduce in the male-dominated Norse settler society. Every third Icelander carries mitochondrial DNA tracing to an Irish woman brought to Iceland against her will. Specific mitochondrial haplogroups, common in Ireland and Scotland, but rare in Scandinavia, appear at significant frequencies in the Icelandic population. These lineages serve as genetic fingerprints, tracing the maternal ancestry of modern Icelanders back to the British Isles, rather than to Norway, providing precise molecular confirmation of the historical slave trade documented in Irish monastic chronicles. The haplogroup frequencies leave no room for alternative explanations. These are specifically Irish and Scottish lineages. The mitochondrial evidence is unambiguous. These were Irish women. Their descendants are Icelandic. The paternal side shows a smaller, but still significant Celtic contribution, roughly 20% of Icelandic Y-chromosomes, traced to the British Isles, suggesting that some Irish and Scottish men also entered the gene pool, likely as male slaves or freedmen who eventually gained reproductive access within the settler society. Some ancient individuals were almost entirely Norse, others almost entirely Celtic, a patchwork, not a uniform mix. In 2018, a second landmark study used ancient DNA from actual Viking Age Icelandic burials. S. Suna Ebenezer's Ititer and colleagues sequenced ancient DNA from 27 Icelandic individuals who lived during the settlement period between 874 and 1000 CE. This was the first direct genetic look at the actual founding population of Iceland rather than their modern descendants. The ancient DNA confirmed and refined the earlier modern DNA findings. The founding population was even more mixed than the modern one. Drift had reduced the Celtic components slightly. The ancient settlers showed approximately 50% Norse ancestry and 50% Gaelic ancestry in some individuals. The founding population was genuinely mixed, not a Norse majority with a small Celtic minority. Some individuals, buried with Norse grave goods, carried predominantly Gaelic ancestry. Culture and genetics did not match. A person buried as a Viking could be genetically Irish. Culture was adopted. Ancestry was permanent. This finding challenged the assumption that archaeological cultural markers like grave goods reliably indicate biological ancestry. In the melting pot of early Iceland, cultural assimilation was rapid and thorough even in the first generation. The study also revealed that genetic drift has significantly reshaped the Icelandic gene pool since the settlement period. Iceland's small founding population, estimated at 10,000 to 20,000 settlers, meant that random genetic drift had an outsized effect on the gene pool over subsequent centuries. Some founding lineages expanded dramatically, while others vanished entirely through pure chance. A small island, a small founding group, 1,000 years of drift that erased some original diversity. Iceland's extreme isolation amplified drift. After settlement, immigration was minimal. The gene pool was sealed. The Black Death reached Iceland in the 15th century and killed roughly half the population. The eruption of Laki in 1783 caused a famine that killed approximately a quarter of the remaining population. Each catastrophe further concentrated the gene pool and intensified the effects of drift on the already small island population. Plague and volcanoes killed indiscriminately. The survivors carried forward whatever ancestral mix they had. Celtic ancestry extends beyond mitochondrial DNA. Autosomal analysis confirmed it throughout the entire Icelandic genome. On average, modern Icelanders carry roughly 20 to 25% Celtic ancestry distributed across their entire genome. This is not a trace amount. It is a fundamental component of who they are biologically. 1/4 of the Icelandic genome comes from people brought to the island in chains. That is the reality. Decode Genetics has used Iceland's unique genetics to become one of the most important research institutions worldwide. Ironically, the genetic diversity introduced by the Irish and Scottish founders has been scientifically valuable. The Celtic contribution created enough genetic variation in the otherwise homogeneous Norse gene pool to enable the identification of disease. Associated genetic variants that have advanced medical genetics worldwide. The slaves made the science possible. Their genetic contribution created the variation that researchers needed. The Slendingabcake traces every Icelander back to the settlement era across 30 documented generations. The genealogical records name the Norse ancestors. They do not name the Celtic slaves who were equally essential to the founding of the population. The DNA fills in the names the sagas refused to record. The sagas recorded the conquerors. DNA recorded the conquered. Both stories are equally real. The Gradaba's law code regulated every aspect of slavery in Iceland. Slaves could be freed through formal manumission ceremonies, but their descendants carried the social stigma of slave ancestry for generations, even as they became indistinguishable genetically from the rest of the population. The legal records document what the sagas romanticized. Icelandic society was built on forced labor. The laws governed slavery. The sagas celebrated the slaveholders. Nobody recorded the names of the enslaved. When slaves appear in the historical record at all, they are described by their function or origin rather than by name. Their Celtic names were taken along with their freedom. The DNA is the only record of their individual existence that survived the systematic erasure of their identities over 1,000 years of Icelandic history. They built the farms, they bore the children, they raised the livestock, and the sagas never mentioned their names. The findings had cultural reverberations in both Iceland and Ireland. For Icelanders, the pure Viking identity required revision. Some Icelanders embraced the findings as a richer and more complex origin story. Others resisted the idea that their Viking heritage was diluted by slave ancestry. The cultural identity was slower to change than the scientific consensus. Identity is harder to update than a genome scan. People do not want to be told their ancestors were slaves. For Ireland, the findings confirmed what historians documented, but the public had forgotten. Vikings enslaved thousands. Iceland was not the only destination. Irish slaves were transported to the Faroe Islands, Norway, and Norse settlements from Greenland to Normandy. The genetic signature of Irish slavery has been detected in populations across the entire Norse colonial world, confirming that the forced movement of Celtic peoples was systematic and continent-wide rather than isolated or incidental. The genetic evidence has implications beyond Iceland. It changes how we understand Viking expansion everywhere. The Viking expansion was not a migration of families. It was predominantly a migration of armed men who acquired women from conquered populations along the way. The resulting colonies were genetically mixed from the very first generation, with Norse paternal lineages and Celtic or local maternal lineages combining to create new populations that were neither purely Scandinavian nor purely local. Orkney, Shetland, the Faroe Islands, and Norse Greenland all show the same genetic pattern as Iceland. The pattern is universal across the North Atlantic. This was not random or accidental. It was a systematic feature of how Viking colonization worked. Armed Norsemen settled new territories and populated them by incorporating local or enslaved women into their households. The Viking expansion was built on two things: ships and slaves. The DNA recorded both. Everywhere the Vikings settled, they brought Irish and Scottish captives. Iceland just preserved the clearest genetic evidence. The Faroe Islands show a similar genetic pattern to Iceland, with significant Celtic maternal ancestry alongside dominant Norse paternal lineages. The pattern repeats across every Norse Atlantic colony. Celtic ancestry, predominantly on the maternal side, appears wherever the Vikings established permanent settlements outside Scandinavia. It was not random mixing. It was a systematic pattern of enslaving Celtic women wherever the Norse expanded. Norse-Icelandic society was legally stratified. The Gráge's law code distinguished between freemen and thralls, with strict rules governing the rights and obligations of each class. Slaves could be freed, but their descendants remained socially marked for generations, even as their genes became indistinguishable from the rest of the population. Norse chieftains and Celtic slaves lived under the same roof. The genetic mixing happened within household walls. Children of Norse men and Celtic women grew up speaking Norse. Within one generation, they were culturally identical. Cultural assimilation erased the visible markers of Celtic ancestry within a single generation, while the genetic markers persisted invisibly for over 1,000 years until modern DNA technology could detect them. When the Althingi was established in 930 CE, the population it represented was already genetically Norse and Celtic. The world's oldest parliament was founded by a mixed population, Vikings and the descendants of their slaves sitting together. The discovery forces a fundamental question about how nations construct founding myths. The Icelandic saga tradition celebrated the Norse founders while erasing the Celtic captives who were equally essential to building the population that became a nation. Modern Icelandic museums now incorporate the genetic evidence alongside the traditional Norse narrative. Today, Icelandic and Irish geneticists collaborate on research connecting the two populations through their shared Viking age heritage. The Celtic genetic contribution carries specific disease risk variants that are found in both Irish and Icelandic populations, but are rare in Scandinavia, confirming the biological connection and providing medically relevant insights for both modern populations. The slaves connected two nations genetically. 1,000 years later, scientists from both countries are tracing that connection together. Today, any Icelander can take a DNA test and see the two ancestral streams that created their genome, the Norse line that the sagas celebrated, and the Celtic line that the sagas erased, both equally real, both equally essential to who they are. The harbor where the first ships arrived still serves the city. Conquerors and captives built it together. The sagas told half the story. DNA told the other half. Together, they tell the truth. One narrative celebrates the powerful, the other reveals the powerless. Both are written in Icelandic DNA. The sagas survive in libraries. The slave ancestry survives in every cell of every Icelander alive today. 1,000 years ago, ships arrived carrying two kinds of people, the free and the enslaved. Both became ancestors. The pure Viking myth was always a fiction. Iceland was built by both conquerors and captives. A third of the maternal ancestry was Irish and Scottish. 20 to 25% of the entire genome was Celtic. The pure Viking myth was a story the powerful told about themselves, and it lasted 1,000 years until DNA gave the slaves a voice. The ships carried conquerors and captives to the same shore. The sagas remembered one. Science remembered the other. If this story changed how you think about who built nations, subscribe. The bones always have more to reveal.